Objection!
Ace Attorney, the beloved visual novel series created by Shu Takumi. For over 20 years, Ace Attorney fans have laughed and cheered as the series' lovable crew of attorneys fight tirelessly to find justice and protect the innocent. For those who don't know, the Ace Attorney franchise generally puts the player in the shoes of a defense attorney faced with an uphill battle to solve a mystery and protect an innocent client framed for murder that they did not commit. And in most cases, you do just that. But not only do our intrepid attorneys get their innocent client found not guilty, they also manage to discover and expose the guilty party, despite that not in any way, shape, or form being their job or how actual court works.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
But the game's individual cases end there, with your client being declared not guilty, and the guilty party's sins laid bare for all to see, just awaiting their ultimate fate of being found guilty and sentenced. But found guilty of what? And sentenced for how long? Well, that's where I come in. Hey everyone, this is Prij from Save Data, and you may know me from Save Data's popular series, Ace Attorney with an Actual Lawyer, where I play the role of the Actual Lawyer, which is what I am. It's true, you can look it up in the Supreme Court of Ohio's Attorney Directory. I'm listed as active in everything. Now, while Attorney Reacts to Ace Attorney videos are not an uncommon YouTube genre, I thought of something fun to try that I think is pretty unique in the Ace Attorney sphere, and something that hopefully you will all enjoy. What I am going to do in this very video essay is attempt to accurately sentence every guilty party in the game, Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. Because, as the intro mentioned, the cases in Ace Attorney do end with the main bad guy being found guilty, presumably of some kind of homicide, but we never get to see what type of homicide charge that they get found guilty of. Not only that, but what other charges could they be found guilty of? And what other people, besides the main culprit, could be found guilty of a crime? So today, I'm going to attempt to parse through some legal language, analyze some crimes, and determine all the charges any guilty party could be convicted of, and what kind of prison sentence they could be serving. How this is all going to work is we are going to go through the first game case by case, from first turnabout to rise from the ashes, and within each case, go character by character and talk about what crimes they might have committed and what sentences those crimes carry. Then, at the end, we will tally up those cumulative crimes to find a final sentence of incarceration and/or fines for each character. This video will presume a familiarity with the cases themselves, as I do not have the time to give a wiki-esque summary of everything that happens. Explaining all the relevant laws will take long enough. Explaining plots is a bridge too far. Now, the Ace Attorney series does canonically take place in Japan, and while I am a total weeb, I am wildly unqualified to study Japan's legal texts. So we are going to use the world of localized Ace Attorney in determining what laws should apply. And since the localized version of Ace Attorney takes place in California, lovingly called Japanifornia by the community, we will be using the California Penal Code as our source for the crimes committed and punishments prescribed. For transparency's sake, I neither live nor practice in California, but I can way more easily access and read their legal codes, so it's a bit of a better fit. First, it's time for a bit of unfun minutia that I am obligated and ethically required to touch upon. First off, disclaimers, both personal and professional. On the personal side, I am not currently practicing in the field of criminal law. I have a degree in criminal justice and took required criminal law classes in law school, but I do not consider myself an expert in this field. Along the same lines, the sentencing of criminals is a very complex topic overall. Judges in America have wide discretion in sentencing criminals and of power in deciding what aggravating and mitigating circumstances may apply and deciding how to weigh them. Plus, any judge, no matter how much they try to avoid it, inevitably brings their personal biases into the courtroom. All of this combined can result in similar situations having surprisingly different results in the legal world. Which is all my way of saying that I may make mistakes in my interpretations, or someone else may come to a different result than me, and we could both still be right. If people want to disagree with me or tell me I'm wrong in the comments, that's fine, just be chill about it. On a legal disclosure side, putting on my best stuffy lawyer voice, nothing in this video is meant to constitute legal advice, nor does anything I say in this video create any sort of lawyer-client relationship with anyone. If you have legal questions, please consult with a licensed professional attorney in your area. This video is for entertainment purposes only. It's silly, but I gotta say it. Finally, the only source I am using for this video is the California Legislative Information website. This is a public domain, free-to-use website where people can access information relevant to California state legislative processes. I used it to access the California Penal Code, which is where I got the text of all the laws I will be discussing in this video. I know we are going through a lot here before I even begin, but there are a couple more things to cover before I get started. Specifically, I want to briefly mention some of the things I will not be covering. This video is going to be pretty long, I reckon, thus I have made the decision to exclude a few things from my analysis to avoid this video becoming too lengthy or overly repetitive, but I will acknowledge these omissions here. First of which is perjury. As any Ace Attorney fan will know, everyone lies in this game. Nearly every witness who takes the stand lies. People who haven't even committed a crime lie on the witness stand. I mean, they kinda have to for the game to work, right? A mystery game where everyone tells the truth would be a pretty lame experience. But as most people know, lying in court is a crime. Specifically, the crime of perjury. California Penal Code Part 1, Title 7, Chapter 5 is devoted to perjury. Section 118 of this chapter states, "Every person who, having taken an oath that he or she will testify, declare, depose, or certify truly before any competent tribunal, officer, or person in any of cases in which the oath may be administered, who willfully and contrary to the oath states as true any material matter which he or she knows to be false, is guilty of perjury." Section 126 of this same chapter makes perjury punishable by imprisonment for 2, 3, or 4 years. So, to shorten this video and eliminate some repetition, when I discuss the crimes a character commits, I am not going to bring up perjury, because I would have to bring it up every time. Literally every time for every character in every possible case. Perjury. Therefore, I'd like you all to use your imagination and picture me saying, for every guilty party I discuss in this video, insert character here also commits perjury, which carries a sentence of 2, 3, or 4 years. You can do that for me, right? Thank you. In the same vein, I'm not going to cover contempt of court either. Because let's face it, the Ace Attorney universe already exists in some kangaroo court alternate dimension where the rules of the courtroom don't matter. The prosecutor is allowed to assault the defense attorney with whips and hot coffee, there is minimal time to investigate before the trial starts, and judges can add random penalties to attorneys' objections. Trying to penalize improper courtroom behavior in this game is a Sisyphusian task, and I'm not going to bother. What I will say is that Part 1, Title 7, Chapter 7 of the California Penal Code describes several offenses against public justice, and these include contempt of court. Section 166 lists a bunch of examples of actions that constitute contempt of court and are thus punishable as misdemeanors. To paraphrase it, contempt of court is any action that unreasonably disturbs, interrupts, or interferes with court proceedings. And once again, this is punishable as misdemeanor. And for clarity's sake, Section 19 of the California Penal Code punishes any misdemeanor that does not list an alternate penalty as punishable by imprisonment in a county jail for 6 months or a $1,000 fine, or both. Finally, one last crime I am generally going to avoid is tampering with the crime scene. It's another offense that every guilty party in this game commits. They all alter the crime scene in some way to avoid implicating themselves and to cast blame on someone else. Legally, the crime charged for this would be found under California Penal Code, Part 1, Title 7, Chapter 6, entitled Falsifying Evidence and Bribing, Influencing, Intimidating, or Threatening Witnesses. Section 141 states, a person who knowingly, willfully, intentionally, and wrongfully alters, modifies, plants, places, manufactures, conceals, or moves any physical matter, digital image, or video recording with specific intent that the action will result in a person being charged with a crime, or with specific intent that the physical matter will be wrongfully produced as genuine or true upon a trial, proceeding, or inquiry, is guilty of a misdemeanor. It's a mouthful of a section, but it encapsulates what every killer does, as this series generally relies on its killers messing with evidence to frame someone else to move the plot forward. There are going to be some cases where I do decide to discuss this, probably because it would have a substantial effect on an individual sentence, or it's the only crime someone commits, but for most of the murderers themselves, I am not going to spend time going over that they commit a crime by altering a crime scene, especially since this crime is only a misdemeanor, and most of the killers are getting enough of a punishment that a misdemeanor has only minimal impact on their final sentence. Those are the only 3 major crimes I plan to avoid, or at least only minimally discuss. Otherwise, I want to get these criminals with anything and everything I think could be brought up as a charge or would be considered by a legitimate prosecutor. And now, without further ado, we can begin in earnest. Back to the first turnabout. Back to, if you're a viewer of Save Data's Ace Attorney Let's Play, a time when I wore a suit on stream, there was no Swedish guy, and I actually cared when the games blatantly ignored court rules.
Just
Lie. Like a dog.
No, don't commit perjury!
What a time! When it comes to the first turnabout, we only have one character worth talking about, and that is obviously the killer himself, Frank Sahwit, and his atrocious purple suit. So let's dive right in. When I first thought about Frank's potential crimes, I actually wanted to start with the way he cases houses. If you don't remember, Frank pretends to be a newspaper salesman in order to learn when his potential marks enter and exit their homes, so he knows the opportune time to break in and steal from them. I was curious whether lying about one's employment in general, or as a means to monitor a house, could constitute a crime on its own. And the short answer is no. At least, not with the information we have available. California Penal Code Part 1, Title 13, Chapter 8, entitled False Personation and Cheats, deals with issues of impersonating people and using impersonation as a means to defraud. From reading through the sections under that chapter, simply identifying oneself as a newspaper salesman when you aren't is not a crime. If Frank had presented false identification of some sort, or had attempted to collect payment for a newspaper he would never be able to deliver, then we may have a different story, and probably some kind of actionable offenses. But the game doesn't give us enough detail here to really pin any crimes on Frank. Now, ahead to much more obvious and provable crimes, let's talk about burglary. Frank Sahwit is, first and foremost, a common thief, or more accurately, a burglar. So let's define that. California Penal Code, Part 1, Title 13, Chapter 2, Section 459 states, every person who enters any house, room, apartment, or other building with intent to commit grand or petite larceny or any felony is guilty of burglary. I'll give the statutory definition of larceny later in this video, but for now, it's enough to know that it means theft. Breaking that definition down, we really only have 2 elements for the crime of burglary. 1, the entering of certain listed locations, an apartment being one of the specifically listed examples, and 2, the intent to commit theft. This one is pretty clear-cut. Frank enters Cindy Stone's apartment and does so with the intent to steal things, as is made clear to us during the case. That's burglary, as simple as it gets. Whether Frank actually makes it out with any possessions of Cindy is irrelevant. Only the intent to steal is necessary. Cindy not being home at the time is also of no consequence to our determination of this criminal offense. California divides burglary into first and second degree under Section 460. This section states that every burglary of an inhabited dwelling house is burglary of the first degree. Under this section, inhabited means that it is used as a dwelling regardless of whether it is currently occupied or not. So given that Cindy Stone's apartment would be considered inhabited, we have a textbook case of first-degree burglary. Burglary of the first degree can be punished by imprisonment for 2, 4, or 6 years under Section 461. Alright, one charge down. Now we get to the real meat and potatoes. The big crime. The one we will return to every case, and sometimes several times in a single case. Homicide. The CPC, I'm just gonna call the California Penal Code CPC from now on. I'm assuming that's cool with everyone. CPC Part 1, Title 8, Chapter 1, is entirely dedicated to homicide. I want to start by clarifying a little bit about homicide as a crime because of the legalese that surrounds it. Laypersons sometimes perceive the terms homicide and murder as interchangeable. In reality, murder is one of the two main types of homicide, with manslaughter being the other. Murder and manslaughter as different crimes are generally separated by the concept of malice, with murder requiring malice and manslaughter occurring in the absence of it. In a legal sense, malice is most easily understood as the intent and desire to kill. I'll throw in an overly simplistic example for clarity. If someone brings a gun to a location and shoots someone with it, that would typically show the clear intent and desire to kill that would constitute malice. Now, if someone starts an unprompted fistfight and accidentally kills someone that they only intended to injure, then there is no intent to kill and therefore no malice. The former situation would bring about a murder charge, the latter would get manslaughter and an overall lighter punishment. Returning back to the CPC, Section 187 defines murder as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought, and like burglary, can be divided into both first and second degree. We are about to enter one of the major gray areas that comes with a case like this, and it begins with the question, did Frank Sahwit have malice aforethought when he killed Cindy Stone? It is possible to argue that Frank, acting in surprise and panic at the thought of being caught, didn't actually mean to kill Cindy. Instead, maybe he only intended to incapacitate her and escape, and this would mean that he is lacking an intent to kill and could only receive a charge for manslaughter. To answer this, we have to dig through and synthesize a couple of different statutory provisions. First, we turn to a clarification on malice found in Section 188, subsection A, stating that, except as stated in subdivision E of Section 189, remember that section, I'll get to it next, in order to be convicted of murder, a principal in a crime shall act with malice aforethought. Malice shall not be imputed to a person based solely on his or her participation in a crime. So while this section states that malice cannot be automatically inferred just because one is a participant in a crime, we have to focus on that except clause, which points us to subsection E of Section 189. That subsection states that a participant in the preparation or attempted preparation of a felony listed in subdivision A, in which death occurs, is liable for murder only if one of the following is proven. 1. The person was the actual killer. Oh, well, that didn't take long. The malice requirement necessary for murder can be imputed upon Frank because he was a participant in a felony in which death occurs and he was the actual killer during said felony. The only question left is whether we have first or second degree murder. This has an easy answer, as Section 189 subdivision A lists a bunch of different circumstances that bring a murder charge into the realm of first-degree murder. But for Frank, all we need to know is that the section states that murder committed during burglary, along with most other major felonies, is murder of the first degree. So, taking Section 188A, Section 189A, and Section 189E, we can summarize thusly. Frank causes the death of another person during the commission of the felony of burglary, and he himself was the actual killer. Malice is deemed to be present under these circumstances, making him liable for murder rather than manslaughter, and that murder charge is going to be found to be of the first degree for the same reason. Phew. Homicide is complicated, and that was only the first one. So let's wrap this up. First degree murder carries 3 possible punishments: death, imprisonment for life without the possibility of parole, or imprisonment for a term of 25 years to life. Now, California has put an indefinite hold on execution since 2006, so I am going to leave that off the table completely when deciding punishments. The law does give guidance on when to prescribe which penalty for first-degree murder. Section 190.2, subsection A, subsection 17, paragraph G, states that if the murder was committed during a burglary of the first or second degree, then imprisonment in the state prison for life without the possibility of parole may be prescribed. Which means Frank Sahwit is going away for life, plus at least 2 additional years for that burglary charge. Bye, Frank. See you never. Wait, Frank Sahwit comes back in a later game? Really? Why? With the introduction case out of the way, it's Turnabout Sisters time. And for this case, we get to talk about 2 different guilty parties. Starting with the less guilty of the 2, let's discuss the many potential crimes from Miss April, May, June, July, August. And boy, there are actually a lot of them. To get into the crimes present in Turnabout Sisters, we have to start before the fateful night of the murder of Mia Fey. April's crimes begin when she wiretaps Mia's phone in order to spy on her. I hope I don't have to explain why wiretapping is a crime, but I will give you the statutory definition. CPC Part 1, Title 15, Chapter 1.5 is entitled Invasion of Privacy, and Section 631 states, any person who, by means of any machine, instrument, or contrivance, intentionally taps or makes any unauthorized connection with any telegraph or telephone wire of any internal telephonic system, or who willfully and without the consent of all parties to the communication, reads or attempts to read or to learn the contents or meaning of any message is punishable by a fine not exceeding $2,500 or by imprisonment in the county jail not exceeding 1 year. So, by placing a wiretap on Mia's phone, April is clearly violating this section and would be subject to the fine or imprisonment listed therein. She uses a device, makes an unauthorized connection on a telephone, and listens to a conversation without the intent of all parties. Cut and dry case of wiretapping, no further analysis needed. For the next potential crime of April, I had to do a little bit of assuming, because the game doesn't actually mention how April got the wiretap onto Mia's phone. That is, did she have to break into the Fay & Co. law offices to plant the wiretap? Or did she, pretend to be a potential client to get into the office and just place it while Mia wasn't looking? Because if she did have to break in, we can probably add a charge of trespass, which is located in Title 14 of CPC's Part 1, which covers a variety of offenses under the umbrella term of malicious mischief. Without diving all the way into the variety of ways trespass can occur, let's stick with the most basic and most applicable one found in Section 602, subsection M. This lists as one of the activities that constitutes trespass as entering and occupying a real property or structure of any kind without the consent of the owner, the owner's agent, or the person in lawful possession. In this definition, occupy simply means to take or hold for use. So, by entering the Fay & Co. law offices and staying at the location long enough to set up the wiretap, the conditions for criminal trespass are met. Trespass of this kind is a misdemeanor which carries a punishment of imprisonment in the county jail not exceeding 6 months, or by fine not exceeding $1,000, or by both. Again, I can't say for certain whether this trespass is present because we are not told how April got the wiretap on Mia's phone, but it seems more likely than not that she did have to break in order to plant it. So I'm going to keep it in. Keeping the trespass in one night, April May already has 18 months in jail or fines worth $3,500 or any allowable combination of the two. Next, we have to move on to the night of the murder itself, where, despite not being the main player, April has a lot to answer for. To start though, we have to briefly discuss the different roles the law gives to people involved in a crime. Jurisdictions have a lot of different approaches to this topic, which is why many people have heard of terms such as accomplice, accessory, or aiding and abetting. These all deal with individuals who had a role in a criminal offense, but did not do the act or acts that constitute criminal activity. California law only details two types of parties to a crime under Section 30 of the CBC. They are principals and accessories. Section 31 states that all persons concerned in the commission of a crime, whether it be felony or misdemeanor, and whether they directly commit the act constituting the offense or aid and abet in its commission, or, not being present, have advised and encouraged its commission, or who, by threats, menaces, command, or coercion, compel another to commit any crime, are principals in any crime so committed. On the other hand, Section 32 states, every person who, after a felony has been committed, harbors or conceals or aids a principal in such felony with the intent that said principal may avoid or escape from arrest, trial, conviction, or punishment, having knowledge that said principal has committed such felony or has been charged with such felony and convicted thereof, is an accessory to such felony. Putting it simply, if you're involved in the crime in any way during its commission, you're a principal, and are thus liable for the full punishment listed in the crime. However, if your part in the crime takes place only after the crime has been committed, and you played no part in it up to committing the crime, you're an accessory. Being an accessory carries its own punishment, listed under Section 33 as a fine not exceeding $5,000 or by imprisonment not exceeding 1 year or by both such fine and imprisonment. I'm going to need to refer to both of these terms throughout this case due to Red White and April May working in tandem. Back to the crimes, we start with Red White's burglary of Fay & Co. law offices to steal Mia's evidence. April aids this in multiple ways. First, her wiretapping the phone helps set the burglary up by providing information, and later, during the burglary itself, she serves as a lookout and false witness for the crime. From these actions, April is almost certainly a principal to this crime. And yes, we have a pretty easy burglary charge here, because Red White entered Fay & Co. law offices with the intent to commit theft of the evidence. As a principal to this crime of burglary, April May can get the same minimum 2-year sentence that we awarded to Frank Sahwit, even though she was not the one who entered the building and stole the evidence. Now, the murder of Mia poses an interesting question. Was it Red White's intention to kill Mia Fay that night he broke into the office to steal the evidence back? I don't recall the case ever giving a clear answer on whether murder was his plan the whole time, or much like Frank's situation, once he got caught in the act, he decided killing Mia was his only option. This matters because if murder was the plan the whole time, then April May's assistance in carrying out the plan would make her a principal to that crime, and this could be true even if she had no prior knowledge that Red White's plan was to commit murder. On the other hand, if Red White only made the decision to commit murder in the spur of the moment, then the argument at least exists that April does not fit into the definition of a principal because nothing she did aided, advised, or encouraged the homicide, just the burglary. But since she helps Red White's involvement by calling the police and making the false report, she is aiding a principal of a crime after its commission. This lines up with the definition of an accessory to a crime. The decision to label April a principal or an accessory for the murder is a tough call. This kind of accomplice liability situation has a lot of different angles of analysis that I simply don't have the time to explore fully. But at the very least, the case for labeling April an accessory is easier to make based on the situation. And that is because Red White, after the murder, calls April and tells her to call the police and say that she saw Maya do it. So her role as an accessory after the fact is clear when she obliges and helps conceal Red White's crime. And honestly, the fact that Red White had to call her and tell her to make the false police report, rather than that being a part of the plan beforehand, lends credence to the idea that killing Mia was not part of the original plan, making the case for treating April as a principal even more tenuous. Therefore, knowing that to convict someone of a crime requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and I am literally here discussing the reasonable doubt I have that April should be deemed a principal, I'm going to conclude that she should only be considered an accessory in the murder of Mia Fay, meaning that April May is a principal in the commission of burglary, but only an accessory in the commission of homicide. Finally, just so I don't forget it, calling the police to lie about a crime is, well, a crime. CPC Part 1, Title 7, Chapter 7, Section 148.5 states that every person who reports to any peace officer that a felony or misdemeanor has been committed, knowing the report to be false, is guilty of a misdemeanor. The statute is probably more designed towards making a fake report, as in saying a crime has happened when no crime has happened, but claiming you saw someone do a crime when you know for certain that's not the case is still a false report, and falls within the wording of this section. This is another misdemeanor of 6 months jail or $1,000 fine, or both. Okay, so April May is taking a lot longer than I expected, but I am somehow still not done. And that is because I feel obligated to at least address the possibility that April may attempt to argue that she acted under duress. Duress is a defense to a criminal conviction that essentially states that someone only committed a crime because they were threatened into doing so. Section 26 of the CPC lays it out that all persons are capable of committing crimes except those belonging to the following categories. One of which being persons who committed the act or made the omission charged under threats or menaces sufficient to show that they had a reasonable cause to and did believe their lives would be endangered if they refused. The argument here is that April knows how dangerous Red White is, and she knows that he is capable and vicious enough to get rid of people who get in his way or oppose him. So she could argue that she felt like she had to carry out these crimes or else he would have harmed or killed her. I generally don't think this would work because we just don't have any evidence that Red White made any actual threats or menaces to April. Her fear of what he is capable of is probably not going to be sufficient on its own to make a viable duress defense. But I would definitely still try and argue that if I was her defense attorney. I'm just doubtful it would work. Alright, for conclusion purposes, let's tally up all of April May's crimes and get a minimum punishment. First, we have 1 year in jail or a $2,500 fine for wiretapping, a misdemeanor trespass charge worth 6 months in jail, a $1,000 fine, or both, misdemeanor false reporting of a crime for the same 6 months or $1,000, accessory after the fact for the crime of homicide nets a 1 year imprisonment or $5,000 fine, or both, and a minimum of 2 years as a principal to burglary. Grand total, potential minimum of 5 years incarceration between jail and prison, and fines potentially equaling as high as $9,500. Not great, but a lot better than what her boss is getting. Progressing on to said boss, I get to speed through a lot of the analysis here, since we covered most of the acts themselves when talking about April, but Red White does have a couple of crimes all his own. To get this out of the way very quickly, the game makes it abundantly clear that as the head of Blue Corp, Red White blackmails or otherwise extorts a lot of people. These would obviously be crimes, but I want to stick to the specific crimes present in-game. So I'm not going to get into it, but I will acknowledge that Red White's committed a lot of extortion-type crimes before the events of Ace Attorney proper. In regards to the crimes that take place during Case 1-2, for the trespass and wiretapping charges that were made against April, Red White would most likely be considered a principal on both of them. Both came under his orders and with his oversight, which places him well within the definition of a principal. Furthermore, if he personally obtained the wiretap used by April, then he is even more so directly involved. Thus, we can start out Red White's rap sheet with the same wiretapping and trespass penalties that we gave April. Continuing with crimes of which we have already discussed the elements of, the burglary charge for breaking into the Fay & Co. law offices is another open and shut case. Red White enters the offices with the intent to steal the evidence that Mia has against him. This is a clear charge of burglary to add to his final sentence. However, along with burglary, Red White commits a second theft-based crime on that fateful night, specifically robbery. Looking at CPC Title 1, Part 8, Chapter 4, entitled Robbery, Section 211 defines it as the felonious taking of personal property in the possession of another from his person or immediate presence and against his will, accomplished by means of force or fear. There are two main elements here. One, the taking of personal property from another against their will, and two, the use of force or fear. When Red White entered the abandoned Fay & Co. offices to steal the evidence, burglary is the name of the game. But when Mia returns, and Red White decides to use force in order to steal the evidence from the office, the crime has transformed into robbery. The satisfaction of the elements are clear here. Red White takes the evidence from Mia's possession, which is obvious by nature of it being owned by her and in her office, and he does so using force, i.e. clocking her with, well, a clock. Now, your initial reaction may be, wait, Prij, why doesn't this apply to Frank from the last case, as he also used violence during a burglary? Now that's a good question, but it hinges on the language that constitutes each crime. The difference is that, to our knowledge, Frank did not end up taking anything from Cindy Stone's house, meaning there was no felonious taking, which is a required element for robbery, but not for burglary. Frank entered with the intent to steal, but retreats with nothing, wanting to avoid implicating himself for the murder. Red White's crime also starts as burglary, but because he actually takes something after using force, it is now also robbery. And while similar, because burglary and robbery contain different elements, Red White can be charged with and convicted of both. Like many crimes under California law, robbery can also be divided into first and second degree. First-degree robbery seems to be limited to robbing people operating vehicles, robbing homes, and robbing banks. Since this crime takes place in an office, and I don't think Mia lives in her office, Red White commits robbery of the second degree. Section 213, subsection A, paragraph 2, punishes robbery of the second degree by imprisonment for 2, 3, or 5 years. With the theft crimes out of the way, let's talk about the killing itself. We can use the same fact pattern that we used against Frank Sahwit to find a first-degree murder charge here as well. The element of malice needed for murder can be imputed upon the perpetrator by nature of the murder taking place during a felony, which could be either the burglary or the robbery, and because Red White is the actual killer himself. This not only makes it murder rather than manslaughter, but also murder of the first degree, because robbery is another of the enumerated felonies that can bring murder into the realm of first degree. To calculate all of these crimes for Red White's potential sentence, we have 18 months in jail, or fines worth $3,500 for the wiretapping and trespass, the minimum 2 years imprisonment for first-degree burglary, plus the minimum 2 years for second-degree robbery. And then for the murder charge, Red White will probably get life in prison without the possibility of parole because the murder was committed during robbery. Not only that, but he committed murder against an officer of the court, and he was attempting to avoid the potential of being prosecuted under the law, which are both mentioned in section 190.2 as circumstances that warrant a life sentence. This all totals up to $3,500 in fines, 18 months in jail, and a life sentence plus 4 more years in prison. Also, I can't think of a better place to put it, but I mentioned time in jail and time in prison separately because the laws prescribe them separately when detailing punishments. But the only real difference between the two is that jail is reserved for minor crimes punished by usually a year at most, while prison is for larger crimes with intended multi-year stays. That's pretty much it, but again, since laws prescribe them separately, I'm going to list them separately as well. But yeah, that's 2 cases down and 3 offenders sentenced. Now, let's move on from clocks to fence posts and talk about turnabout samurai. As you may be aware, the American justice system is not capable of prosecuting and punishing the deceased. However, a video essay is. And because there are a couple of interesting facets to a situation that won't be covered in other cases, let's talk about the victim of Turnabout Samurai, Jack Hammer, and the possible crimes he could face had he survived long enough to have his day in court. The event that serves as the catalyst for everything that happens in Turnabout Samurai occurs 5 years prior to the present day of the first Ace Attorney game. As a brief reminder, Jack Hammer and another actor named Manuel are filming a scene together, during which Jack accidentally pushes Manuel, who ends up falling on a spiked fence, which impales and kills him. So, just for funsies, let's look at the potential liability here. While Dee Vasquez later suggests otherwise, to the best of our knowledge, the death of Manuel is a complete accident and not in any way intentional by Jack. Ending a life unintentionally doesn't preclude a homicide conviction, but we can look to the CPC to address situations where homicide is excusable. As stated in our homicide chapter under section 195, homicide is excusable when committed by accident and misfortune or in doing any other lawful act by lawful means with usual and ordinary caution and without any unlawful intent. The player never gets the full story of what happened with Manuel's death, but given what we do know, it does seem to fall under the wording of section 195. The dangerousness of the scene they were filming and its proximity to a sharp fence could be seen as a lack of caution on the part of the studio, but that wouldn't make Jack liable and is more likely a civil matter. There really is no evidence that Jack wasn't acting with usual caution while filming the scene, nor that he acted with any unlawful intent. So, for the death of Manuel, Jack would most likely avoid prosecution or be found not guilty if the case did go to court. Now, what Jack does later, that's where he's going to find himself in trouble. And that is his plan to get revenge on Dee Vasquez. Jack Hammer's first crime comes with his decision to drug Will Powers. Jack's plan of slipping sleeping pills into Will Powers' food in order to help frame him falls under provision of the CPC dealing with assault with intent to commit felony. Specifically, section 222, which states, "Every person guilty of administering to another any chloroform, ether, laudanum, or any controlled substance, anesthetic, or intoxicating agent, with intent thereby to enable to assist himself or herself or any other person to commit a felony, is guilty of a felony punishable by imprisonment in the state prison for 16 months or 2 or 3 years. Pretty clear violation here. We don't know exactly what sleeping agent Jack used, but the statute is broad enough to include pretty much anything that can count as an intoxicating agent, so that's good enough. And Jack does this specifically as part of his plan to kill Dee Vasquez, which is obviously a felony. So Jack would definitely be on the hook for at least 16 months from this. Now, the next part of Jack's plan goes a little bit awry, in that he dies. But before that, he does attempt to kill Dee Vasquez. An attempt of a crime, in most circumstances, is a crime itself. Attempt, while much more complicated in practice, is pretty self-explanatory on its face. When someone takes action to commit certain crimes, but is unable to complete them, they can be charged with attempt, and can often receive a punishment as strict as if they had completed the offense. In California, attempted murder is described in section 664, which states, "Every person who attempts to commit any crime but fails or is prevented or intercepted in its perpetration shall be punished as follows. If the crime attempted is willful, deliberate, and premeditated murder, the person guilty of that attempt shall be punished by imprisonment in the state prison for life with the possibility of parole." Jack's attempt to kill Dee is obviously going to be deemed willful, deliberate, and premeditated. Putting Will to sleep and stealing the costume both speak to this being a clearly planned murder attempt. Therefore, if Jack Hammer had survived, he would have been sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole for attempted murder, with an additional minimum of 16 months in prison from the charge arising from slipping Will Powers the sleeping pills. But Jack died like a chum, so instead he gets the afterlife. So it goes. Next, let us move forward to the intended victim of Turnabout Samurai, Dee Vasquez, but also back to the death of Manuel. We established more likely than not, Jack Hammer is not liable for Manuel's death, but a crime is still committed here. And that is because in an attempt to prevent a scandal from breaking out, Dee tries to hide the circumstances surrounding Manuel's death. Section 152A of the CPC states that every person who, having knowledge of an accidental death, actively conceals or attempts to conceal that death shall be guilty of a misdemeanor punishable by imprisonment in a county jail for not more than 1 year, or by a fine of not less than $1,000 nor more than $10,000, or by both that fine and imprisonment. I don't think the player gets the full details of everything Dee does to conceal Manuel's death, but we do know she at least gets a hold of a picture of the incident taken by a member of the press and prevents that picture from going public. And given that word never gets out about what happens, it's safe to say she took additional steps to hide the truth around the accidental death of Manuel. And that appears to fit the statutory definition pretty well. So she's going to be on the hook for that misdemeanor charge to start. And with that incriminating picture in hand, Dee decides to commit some more crimes. This time, it's extortion. CPC Part 1, Title 13, Chapter 7 is entirely devoted to the crime of extortion. The definition of extortion, found in Section 518A, is as follows. Extortion is the obtaining of property or other consideration from another with his or her consent, induced by a wrongful use of force or fear. The first element of extortion is the obtaining of property or other considerations. While Dee doesn't make Jack give her money to hide the photo, she does force him to take a lower paycheck and agree to any role she demands of him. The labor and the decreased pay would both constitute the legal definition of consideration for this element to be satisfied. For the second element, the wrongful use of force or fear, we have a section in the CPC that gives examples of threats that can constitute the wrongful use of fear to induce another person to act. Specifically, Section 519, which includes as relevant examples, to accuse the individual threatened of a crime, to expose or to impute to him a deformity, disgrace, or crime, and to expose a secret affecting him. Whether the truth about Jack's role in Manuel's death is a crime, simply a disgrace, or even just a secret, it's clear that Dee uses this event to scare Jack. And it is this fear that causes Jack to debase himself at Dee's command, unlike Sal Manella, who debases himself for his own pleasure. As both elements of extortion are present, Dee could face prosecution for extortion. Section 520 punishes extortion by imprisonment for 2 to 4 years. But Dee can't stop with just hiding one death. She's got another death to hide. This time, it's Jack Hammer's death, and it leads us to talk about both manslaughter and self-defense. Even if you've never studied an ounce of law in your life, you know what self-defense is, and you can probably tell it applies to Dee's case. The game even mentions that Dee would probably have an argument for self-defense. Before we define it, however, let's discuss what Dee could be charged with. And what she could be charged with is manslaughter, the other major homicide charge. We once again return to malice. Dee, while being a pretty villainous person, had no desire to kill Jack that day. Quite the opposite. As long as Dee has the blackmail, she can continue extorting Jack for cheap labor. Just as capitalism intended, am I right? So, when Jack comes to kill her and she fights back, she is clearly not trying to kill him. So there would be no malice to be found, and we are left with a manslaughter charge. Section 192 of the CPC outlines the definition of manslaughter and its 3 types, stating, manslaughter is the unlawful killing of a human being without malice. It is of 3 kinds. A. Voluntary, upon a sudden quarrel or heat of passion. B. Involuntary, in the commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, or in the commission of a lawful act which might produce death in an unlawful manner or without due caution and circumspection, and C. Vehicular. Vehicular manslaughter is clearly not relevant here, so I'm not going to go into its really long definition. Whether Dee commits voluntary or involuntary manslaughter is a bit of an interesting question. Voluntary may seem tempting because with Jack coming to try and kill her, that may fit the definition of upon a sudden quarrel. But that verbiage tends to refer to an argument turned violent, not when someone is trying to kill you and you fight back. Involuntary feels like the better fit, because pushing someone away from you while on a staircase next to a sharp fence seems to fit the wording of, in the commission of a lawful act which might produce death. Pushing someone away from you isn't illegal, but it certainly can be dangerous depending on the situation. It's probably the closest fit if I had to assign some criminal charge to Dee here. But I'm not really going to spend much more time on this analysis, because the existence of self-defense here is pretty obvious. So obvious, in fact, that if this manslaughter charge was the only thing on the table, Dee probably wouldn't even get prosecuted because it's basically an unwinnable case for the prosecutor. For the sake of thoroughness, though, let's look at section 197 to talk about self-defense. That section reads, homicide is also justifiable when committed by any person in any of the following cases. 1. When resisting any attempt to murder any person, or to commit a felony, or to do some great bodily injury upon any person. No need to read any more of the definition. Dee commits homicide while resisting Jack's attempt to kill her. Clearly an instance of justifiable homicide. As such, Dee Vasquez would not face any punishment for this occurrence alone. However, when Dee moves to hide the truth about Jack's death, she commits another crime. And this is one of the few instances where I will talk about the crime of falsifying evidence, since it is much more impactful in Dee's case. Since I already defined it in the intro, I'm not going to do it again. The acts that would satisfy the crime, however, include Dee and Sal moving Jack's body, putting his body into the evil magistrate costume, and burning the steel samurai costume. All actions that willfully, intentionally, and wrongfully alter evidence with a specific intent that Will Powers will be found guilty. This carries the standard misdemeanor penalty. When we add it all up, Dee Vasquez could be sentenced to the following: 1 year in jail, or a fine between $1,000 and $10,000 for hiding an accidental death, 2 to 4 years imprisonment for extortion, and this could potentially be multiple counts of extortion for all the different things she forced Jack to do, and then the standard 6 months jail sentence and $1,000 fine that comes from a misdemeanor. In total, Dee gets 18 months in jail, between 2 to 4 years in prison, and between $2,000 and $11,000 in fines. It's also worth noting that during the investigation, the game reveals that Dee has pretty heavy ties to the mob, so while I won't go into what that could mean for her criminal sentence since we simply don't have the details to even begin to discuss it, this whole thing could end up much worse for Dee than the punishment I've outlined already. But that's show business, baby! To finish off Turnabout Samurai, I feel like I owe it to the world to at least attempt to get Sal Manella off the streets and make the world just a little more pleasant of a place. Unfortunately, it's not going to be as long as I want. And it's both for things I've already discussed. First, and most easily assigned, is the same falsifying evidence misdemeanor that we gave Dee Vasquez. He does all the same actions that Dee does to obscure the truth of Jack's death and frame Will. So that's one misdemeanor for him. The second and more interesting one is whether Sal could be considered an accessory after the fact to the murder of Jack Hammer. The answer, however, is probably no. An accessory can only be charged when they aid a principal after a felony has been committed. If we believe Dee Vasquez would have been acquitted in the murder of Jack due to acting in self-defense, then no felony was committed, and therefore Sal can't be an accessory to anything. The falsifying evidence charge still stands, but that's a misdemeanor, and there is no accessory after the fact to a misdemeanor in California law. Which means that the best we can do is get Sal sentenced to 6 months in county jail and give him a fine of $1,000. Bummer. Really freaking hate that guy. But before we move on, we have to talk about the real criminal of Case 1-3. The Fence. Both Manuel and Jack Hammer's lives were tragically cut short by the sick, twisted machinations of that fence. Homicide? Definitely. Premeditated? Deliberate? Done with extreme malice? You tell me. No, I'll tell you. Abso-freaking-lutely. Look at that thing. You can't even begin to imagine what evils it's capable of. We gotta get this bastard once and for all. 2 counts of first-degree murder for the Fence. Sentence, capital punishment. Justice is served. Ah! Elevator picture jump scare! You know what that means. It's DL6 time. Get your elevators, earthquakes, and misplaced aggression ready? We gotta talk about the pivotal event of the first Ace Attorney game. As we all remember and Miles desperately tries to repress, the DL6 incident begins when Yanni Yogi gets on an elevator with the Edgeworth father and son duo. During their ride, an earthquake strikes and leaves the trio stranded in the elevator for 5 hours. Yanni, panicking at the situation, begins to attack Gregory Edgeworth, who ends up dead by the time the trio are rescued. As we learn, Yanni is not the one who killed Gregory, but he did attack him, so let's discuss that. Most laypersons recognize the terms assault and battery. However, it is not always understood correctly. Assault and battery, while often grouped together, are actually 2 different crimes. To understand them in their simplest terms, assault is the threat and attempt of violence, while battery is the actual infliction of violence. But just so you have the statutory definitions, CPC defines battery as any willful and unlawful use of force or violence upon the person of another. Assault, on the other hand, is defined in section 240 of the same chapter as an unlawful attempt coupled with a present ability to commit a violent injury on the person of another. In this case, Yanni Yogi does commit assault and battery upon Gregory when he attacks him in the elevator. Now, there are many subsections on battery based on the type of weapon used, the damage caused, and other circumstances, but given what we know about the DL6 incident, we would probably charge Yanni with just simple battery. We know that Yanni didn't use his gun because it fell out of his holster and Miles gets a hold of it, and we don't know of any other weapons he could have used. So, given that Yanni only uses his hands and doesn't really cause any significant injuries to Gregory, we can't elevate this battery charge to anything above the lowest form of battery, which, under section 243 subsection A, is punishable by a fine not exceeding $2,000 and imprisonment in a county jail not exceeding 6 months, or both. Also, since under California law, assault is defined as essentially an attempt at battery, assault is what is called a lesser included offense to the crime of battery, since the completion of battery requires assault. All this means is that since battery has been charged, you cannot also charge Yanni with assault because it's automatically included in the offense of battery. It's a little confusing and varies very significantly between jurisdictions, but essentially it just means I'm not going to go into an assault charge because the battery charge is already present. Returning to the events of the game, Yanni escapes his charge of murder against Gregory through an insanity plea. I want to analyze this briefly because the same plea could work against the battery charge described above. Insanity is a very complicated subject in criminal law, so let's just stick to the basics to understand how it may unfold in an actual California court. To start, in California, insanity has to be pled at the stage of the court case where a defendant enters a plea of guilty, not guilty, or no contest. This would involve making the formal plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. You are not allowed to enter a normal not guilty plea and then bring in insanity as a defense later to negate an element of a crime. Evidence of diminished capacity can be brought in at the sentencing stage in an attempt to reduce the sentence given. But if you want to bring in insanity as a defense during a trial to escape culpability completely, you have to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. The full description of the insanity plea is found in section 25B of the CPC, and states, in any criminal proceeding in which a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity is entered, the defense shall be found only when the accused person proves, by a preponderance of the evidence, that he or she was incapable of knowing or understanding the nature and quality of his or her act, and of distinguishing right from wrong at the time of the commission of the offense. This version of the insanity defense requires 2 things to be proven, as stated above. The first is the defendant's inability to understand the nature and quality of their actions, and the second is the inability to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the action. Applying these to Yanni's case, I can understand why canonically he was found not criminally liable. The 3 were stuck in the elevator for around 5 hours when the action occurred. They were also apparently running out of air. And yeah, it's probably not possible to suffocate an elevator since they aren't airtight, but the game tells us they were, so we'll just take it as fact. Given that Yanni was scared, panicking, and oxygen deprived, it feels reasonable to say he was not able to understand what he was doing, nor that his actions were wrongful. In line with the game's conclusion, I think Yanni avoids the punishment for the battery charge from the elevator incident thanks to an insanity plea, assuming it was properly pled. I could honestly spend a long time diving into California's insanity test and how that changes the trial and subsequent results, but we simply don't have the time to get lost in the weeds of that. So I think acknowledging that Yanni has a valid case for an insanity plea is enough, so I'm not going to include it in his final sentence. And once again, the game says it works, so we can just take that as fact, even if there might be reasons to disagree or it requires further analysis. Moral of the story is, I won't include the battery charge in Yanni's final sentence. Next, for a crime that needs much less analysis, Yanni Yogi absolutely 100% commits first-degree murder when he kills Robert Hammond. Yanni invites Hammond out for the express purpose of killing him, and kill him he does. While Von Karma plans the murder and gives Yanni the instructions, none of that changes the analysis of Yanni's culpability. Yanni is deliberate and intentional in his decision to kill Hammond, constituting express malice. And briefly jumping back to section 198 subsection A to detail what constitutes first-degree murder, there is a catch-all wording that makes all willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing equate to murder of the first degree. And given that this whole thing was planned in advance and required multiple moving parts, I have no issue finding this to be a premeditated killing. It's about as simple a case for first-degree murder that you can find. With my decision to allow the insanity plea to negate the battery charge, Yanni Yogi is left with 25 years to life from a first-degree murder charge and nothing else. Manfred von Karma. This guy. We should send this dude to prison just on principle. And also because he killed Gregory Edgeworth, which is, not nice. Jumping back to the DL6 incident, we learn that the true culprit is von Karma, who, after getting hit by the unluckiest stray bullet in history, heads on over to the elevator to find 3 unconscious people and a gun. Then, in a real asshole move, he shoots Gregory Edgeworth in revenge for Gregory having caused von Karma to get a penalty. That's it. Just a penalty. You didn't even lose the case, Manny. Your stupid record is still perfect. No need to kill a dude and then weirdly decide to adopt his son. Whatever. The only thing worth discussing here is what the homicide charge will be. Some of the circumstances may lead someone to conclude that this should be a voluntary manslaughter charge, but I'm gonna quickly dispel those. Voluntary manslaughter is a killing committed upon a sudden quarrel or heat of passion. I'd argue you really can't have a sudden quarrel when the other party is unconscious like Gregory was, so this doesn't work. There exists the argument that getting shot in the shoulder, combined with Von Karma's festering anger over the trial, could be considered a sudden heat of passion, but I'm not buying that either. The time between Von Karma getting the penalty during the court case and the elevator incident, at least 5 hours, is gonna be enough time for any heated emotions to cool down. At least for a reasonable person, that is. Neither of the preconditions of a voluntary manslaughter really apply here, so this should be considered murder. The reason I lean towards that is that the malice requirement necessary for murder can be, per section 188 subsection A paragraph 2, implied when no considerable provocation appears or when the circumstances attending the killing show an abandoned and malignant heart. And since I don't think the provocation is adequate here, along with the very reasonable conclusion that murdering an unconscious man next to his damn son shows an abandoned heart, I'm gonna find malice and thus murder. And not only am I calling it murder, but I'm calling it first-degree murder for the reason of premeditation. This may seem odd because the time between finding the 3 in the elevator and Von Karma's decision to kill Gregory isn't that long, and some may argue that the minimal time gap precludes a finding of premeditation. However, in criminal law, premeditation can be achieved without a lengthy period of reflection, and as Section 189 subsection D puts it, to prove the killing was deliberate and premeditated, it is not necessary to prove the defendant maturely and meaningfully reflected upon the gravity of the defendant's act. This means that the short amount of time between Von Karma seeing the 3 unconscious people in the elevator, noticing the gun, and deciding to use it to shoot and kill Gregory is enough time for the killing to be considered premeditated. And there is no question that it was willful. Von Karma considered the act enough to realize he could get his revenge, and that he could get away with it because no one else was around to witness it. A court could, and in my opinion should, find that sufficient for a first-degree murder charge worth 25 years to life. For the killing of Robert Hammond, we have another first-degree murder charge as well, and this one I have even less doubts about. It is certainly true that Von Karma takes no direct role in killing Hammond, only sending Yanni the instructions to do so, but in our definition of a principal to a crime that we discussed earlier, in listing what makes one a principal, it includes the phrase, or not being present, have advised and encouraged its commission. That's Von Karma to a T. He planned the entire crime, and once that gets proven, he is going to be deemed a principal in the first-degree murder of Robert Hammond. That's first-degree murder charge number 2, another 25 years to life at least. But Manfred von Karma is a man of many talents. He can do more than just murder people and make plans to murder people, he can also tase them. I am referring to, of course, that time that Von Karma tases both Phoenix and Maya while in the records room so he can steal evidence. Which, hey, is also a crime. As I mentioned when we first discussed battery, the penalty for battery can change a lot based on the weapon used. Specifically, that guns and other deadly weapons carry harsher penalties. I was curious what I would end up landing on in regards to the deadliness of a stun gun, since they aren't designed to kill, but they certainly can. However, California had my back, because there is a specific subsection in the chapter on assault and battery that speaks to assaults done with the use of a stun gun, which, I'm not gonna lie, that was kind of awesome to find. Section 244.5, subsection B, states that every person who commits an assault upon the person of another with a stun gun shall be punished by imprisonment in a county jail for a term not exceeding 1 year, or by imprisonment for 16 months, 2 or 3 years. There we have it, a stun gun statute, one that Von Karma very clearly breaks, not once, but twice. 2 counts of assault with a stun gun, or a minimum 2 years in jail, or between 32 months to 6 years in prison. And to quickly clear out any potential confusion, when the term assault is used in conjunction with a weapon type, as in assault with a stun gun, in that context, assault includes both an attempt to attack and the completed attack itself. California doesn't use terms such as battery with a deadly weapon, it's called assault with a deadly weapon. So if you try to punch someone and miss, it's called assault. If the punch lands, it's called battery. If you try and stab someone with a knife, it's called assault with a deadly weapon, regardless of whether you succeed or not. It's confusing and I honestly kind of hate it, but I don't write their laws of California. Yet. Staying in the evidence room, after stun gunning 2 people, Von Karma steals evidence, a violation of Section 135 of the CPC. This section states, a person who, knowing that any book, paper, record, instrument in writing, digital image, video recording, or other matter or thing is about to be produced in evidence upon a trial, inquiry, or investigation authorized by law, who willfully destroys, erases, or conceals the same with the intent to prevent it or its contents from being produced, is guilty of a misdemeanor. Von Karma, fearing that the old records of the DL6 incident would be brought in as evidence, takes the evidence to conceal it from Phoenix and anyone else, a clear violation of Section 135 and a clear misdemeanor. So, let's put away this absolute jackass of a prosecutor for good. Most obviously, Von Karma is screwed with 2 counts of first-degree murder, carrying a minimum of 50 years in prison. I do feel that the court would not look too kindly on Von Karma killing 2 of its own, so I highly doubt Von Karma even gets the minimum. Add in 2 counts of assault with a stun gun, equaling somewhere between 32 months to 6 years in prison, and then finally, a misdemeanor charge for stealing prospective evidence, worth 6 months in jail and up to $1,000 in fines, or both. All in all, Von Karma will die in prison sometime during his minimum 52.5-year sentence. Plus, he's got to pay that $1,000 fine. Crushing. And with that, Case 4 is complete. From DL6 to SL9, it's time for an absolute doozy of a case with Rise from the Ashes, the bonus final case of the first Ace Attorney game. And much like the DL6 incident, we have to go back in time before the events of the game. And when it comes to SL9, we return once again to the underworld to talk about the late Joe Darke. Joe Darke's story is a simple and honestly much too common one. It starts with a normal drive home from work, moves on to killing 5 people, eventually progresses to kidnapping and hostage taking, and then ends with getting sentenced to death for the one murder you actually didn't commit. Pretty standard stuff. I've been there, you've been there. A relatively normal life experience. Once again, our ability to sentence Joe Darke is somewhat hampered by a lack of information, particularly what to do with the first death he causes. The game describes the beginning of the SL9 killings as Joe Darke accidentally running someone over with his car on his way home from work. I brought it up briefly before, but the 3 types of manslaughter are voluntary, involuntary, and vehicular. Vehicular manslaughter would be the crime here, should there be one. However, not all deaths caused by car accidents are vehicular manslaughter, obviously. The statutory definition of vehicular manslaughter is relatively complex, but it generally involves committing an unlawful act while driving or driving with gross negligence. Vehicular manslaughter is going to arise in situations where the driver is intoxicated, distracted on their phone, running a red light, not using proper caution during inclement weather, etc., etc. A car accident involving hitting a pedestrian could leave the driver without liability in situations where the victim ran out into the street without warning, or jumped out onto the street from the bushes, or tried jogging down the highway. Situations where it's not the driver's negligence that causes the accident would generally not be considered vehicular manslaughter, even if it causes death. In Joe Darke's case, no information on the circumstances of the car accident are given, so I feel like including a vehicular manslaughter charge would be too presumptuous, so I won't add it to his final tally. Again, maybe we can assume that since he tries to hide it, it's his fault, but even then, I'm still too hesitant to really declare it anything since we just don't have any information. But after Joe Darke kills the first person, whether criminally or not, he then kills a witness to the car accident, kills a witness to the second killing, kills a child that saw that killing, and finally kills someone who sees him burying the other 4 bodies. Damn. Chill out, dude. So while I'm not confident on the vehicular manslaughter charge, I feel much more so on the other 4 counts of first-degree murder for, everything afterwards. The malice necessary for murder is going to be implied from the fact that Joe is killing to avoid any potential repercussions from the accident and subsequent other murders. And he clearly wasn't provoked or anything. And those 4 murder charges will be first-degree because they are willful, deliberate, and premeditated. Once again, premeditation does not require a discernible time period of reflection. His conscious decision to end each victim because they are a potential witness to other crimes should be seen by a court as enough to satisfy the catch-all terminology found in the definition of first-degree murder. 4 counts of first-degree murder as part of a spree killing is, gonna get you the worst possible punishment. That man is never getting out of jail. And while it's not going to affect his criminal sentence, I will mention Joe Darke's other crimes as well. Joe Darke eventually turns himself into the police to confess, but then, for reasons the game doesn't explain, decides he doesn't want to turn himself in and escapes during questioning. Upon his escape, he finds talented artist Lana Skye and holds her hostage when Neil Marshall arrives. A quick jump to Title 8 of the CPC gives us the sections needed for analyzing the crimes Joe commits here. Section 210.5 on hostages tells us that every person who commits the offense of false imprisonment, against a person for the purposes of protection from arrest, which substantially increases the risk of harm to the victim, or for purposes of using the person as a shield, is punishable by imprisonment for 3, 5, or 8 years. Section 236 defines false imprisonment as the unlawful violation of the personal liberty of another. Anytime you restrain someone or lock someone in a room, you are looking at false imprisonment. So, to apply that to the situation at hand, Joe Darke grabs Emma and restricts her freedom of movement, which completes the false imprisonment part. And he uses her as a shield to protect himself from arrest, and definitely increases the risk of harm to her on account of having a damn knife pointed at her. That's textbook hostage taking, and that's 3 to 8 years. And honestly, you could even argue for adding some additional charges, including an attempted murder charge for when Joe attacks Emma, or any number of crimes for his fight with Neil, whether it be another count of attempted murder or assault with a deadly weapon, or just plain old battery. Hell, even resisting arrest is a misdemeanor. I'm fast forwarding a little bit here because Joe Darke does not really warrant any more of this video than he already has, but there's a lot of crimes being committed here. Even if you wanted to quantify his punishment in years, it's over 100 alone on the murder charges. Canonically in the game, Joe Darke is put to death, and if California still did that, that's what would absolutely happen. Regardless, put multiple sentences on the guy, plus probably over 100 years more, because our justice system allows punishments of a life sentence plus an additional number of years. Great, got him, moving on, he's dead anyway. Next, we grab our water wings and head for the pool, because it's swimming time with Damon Gant, everyone's favorite creepy Dorito shit troll. If the second part of that joke makes no sense to you, watch our Let's Play.
Sometimes I forget which room's which and I take a dump in the evidence room.
Damon Gant's crimes begin where Joe Darke's ends. That is, after the scuffle between Darke and Neil in Gant's own office. It is then and there that Gant comes up with his brilliant scheme to both ensure Darke's conviction and advance his own career. That plan begins with the decision to kill Neil Marshall. Specifically, he grabs Neil's unconscious body and impales it on a suit of armor behind him, which is pretty fucked up, honestly. This is yet another straightforward homicide analysis. The malice necessary for a murder charge here is clear. There is both an intent and desire to kill, easily implied by how much thought Gant puts into this whole scheme and how he decides to manipulate and screw over so many people. And by the same logic, all that planning as well establishes the premeditation element necessary to make this murder of the first degree. It is also worth noting that Section 190.2 makes the punishment for first-degree murder life in prison without the possibility of parole if the victim was a prosecutor, and the murder was intentionally carried out to prevent the performance of the prosecutor's duties. Now, I don't know if Neil was technically performing his prosecutorial duties when he was chasing after Joe Darke, but I do feel confident that a court isn't going to look too kindly on killing a prosecutor, regardless of the technicalities. More likely than not, Gant is already on the hook for a life sentence for the murder of Neil Marshall before the events of Case 1-5 even begin. Gant then implements the next part of his plan. He first hides some evidence and alters the crime scene, which is obviously a crime, but I've already said I'm not going to go into every misdemeanor of this type for every killer. When Lana arrives, Gant has her finish tampering the scene and lies to her about the truth, commencing his next major crime, a whole ton of extortion. The extortion here is very similar to what occurred in Turnabout Samurai between Dee Vasquez and Jack Hammer. Gant doesn't ask for money or other tangible property, but essentially demands Lana's complete and total loyalty and obedience. And any actions that Lana commits under Gant's orders could be labeled consideration under the definition of extortion. And the wrongful use of fear necessary to extort someone includes in its definition to accuse an individual or a relative of theirs of a crime. Gant is using the potential of accusing Lana's sister Emma for a crime that he committed in order to force Lana to obey his every order. And even if Emma probably wouldn't be convicted, even if she had actually caused Neil's death, and even though the truth is that Emma did nothing wrong, Lana does not know that, which Gant uses to keep her under his control. So, we've got consideration, we've got fear, and that equals extortion. And extortion is worth 2 to 4 more years in prison for Gant. And honestly, it's probably multiple counts of extortion, given the many things we have to assume that Gant makes Lana do for him in the years since SL9. We fast forward many years, and Gant thinks he has gotten away with it. But when Jake Marshall and Bruce Goodman attempt to reopen the SL9 incident, Gant takes action. And by action, I mean crime, and by crime, I mean more murder. The murder here occurs when Gant stabs Bruce Goodman with Darke's knife by the evidence lockers. And once again, I am going to have to call this murder. I apologize if this is getting a bit repetitive, but there's a lot of murder in these games, and I feel obligated to acknowledge the satisfaction of any required elements. And also, I actually think this is the last murder we have to talk about in this game, so one more time. The malice component here is once again that Gant acts with a willful intent to kill so as to ensure his crimes stay hidden. Now, when it comes to the degree of murder, I was tempted to consider whether this was second-degree murder as opposed to first, because the premeditation element here feels even more questionable than in other situations, but I then learned it actually doesn't matter in the long run because of one specific fact. Bruce Goodman is a detective, and detectives are included in the broadly defined term of peace officer. You can look to CPC Part 2, Title 3, Chapter 4.5 for a full explanation of all the jobs that can be considered peace officers, but all we care about is that it includes detectives. This matters because Section 190 subsection C of the CPC states, "Every person found guilty of murder in the second degree shall be punished by imprisonment in the state for a term of life without the possibility of parole if the victim was a peace officer who was killed while engaged in the performance of his or her duties and the defendant knew that the victim was a peace officer engaged in the performance of his or her duties, and any of the following facts have been charged and found true." Those aforementioned facts include the defendant specifically intended to kill the peace officer. So, while typically second-degree murder has a punishment of 15 years to life, because Gant killed a detective who was in the course of his duties, the punishment is life without possibility of parole. Here, the difference between first and second-degree murder is actually irrelevant for the sake of deciding a final sentence. If you commit murder against a peace officer, it's life in prison without parole. And that's not to say that Gant couldn't get first-degree murder, I just don't really want to waste time on the premeditation issue because it's another life sentence no matter what. Also, yes, Gant steals evidence, I think, multiple times during this thing, so, like Von Karma, throw in at least one misdemeanor stealing evidence charge, probably more, but what does it matter? Add in at least 2 counts of extortion regarding Lana Skye, 1 for each of the murders he forces her to help with, and that's another 4 to 8 years. 2 life sentences, plus at least 4 more years. Damon Gant, like Von Karma, will die in prison. Moving from someone you should feel no sympathy for, to someone you should probably feel at least some sympathy for, it's time to talk about Lana Skye. As mentioned in the prior segment, Lana is the victim of some pretty cruel manipulation by Gant through all the extortion he does. Unfortunately, being a victim of extortion does not constitute duress and does not absolve Lana of her criminal liability during the S9 incident and the events of Rise from the Ashes. Let's start with Lana's culpability during the SL9 incident, as this one is really interesting. And that is because, in reality, what Lana is doing during the SL9 incident, when she obscures the truth around Neil's death, is she is acting as an accessory to his murder, with Damon Gant being the principal. However, Lana does not know this. At that time, she is completely unaware that Gant is the killer. And the definition of an accessory includes the very specific wording that the person acting as an accessory is acting with the intent to assist the principal to avoid or escape arrest. Lana is not acting with the intent to help Gant avoid a criminal charge, even if that's what she is actually doing. What she thinks she is doing is helping Emma escape arrest. Lana is, in a sense, trying to act as an accessory to the crime that she believes Emma committed. But even if Emma was responsible for Neil's death, did she actually commit a crime that Lana could be an accessory to? If things went down like Gant wants Lana to believe, Emma acts out of a misguided attempt to protect Neil. Emma definitely does not have any intent to kill someone. It would fall into the scope of involuntary manslaughter, or more likely be deemed a complete and total accident. And even if Emma was charged with involuntary manslaughter, it would never stick, given that Emma is attempting to act in defense of Neil Marshall. It's a mistake in self-defense, as Emma was wrong about who had the knife and who was in danger, but a mistake of fact can be a valid defense to criminal charges should the individual's mistake be honest and reasonable, which Emma's was. Taking all that into consideration, the point is that Emma would most likely not be found guilty of any crime for what happened during the scuffle between Neil and Darke, and this could have a major effect on Lana's case. That is because if Lana is not acting with the intention to aid Gant in escaping arrest, and the person she is intending to help escape arrest hasn't actually committed a felony, then Lana isn't an accessory to the murder of Neil Marshall, even if Gant is using her as such. Therefore, what I would actually charge Lana with in the SL9 incident is the misdemeanor charge that comes from falsifying evidence, because what they do is frame Joe Darke for Neil's death. This is the same misdemeanor charge we talked about with Dee Vasquez and Sal Manella when they try to blame Will for the death of Jack Hammer. And it's a lot less time behind bars than if Lana was an accessory to murder. Now, through some tricky legalese there, I was able to get Lana off the hook for Neil Marshall. However, for the second murder of Bruce Goodman, not only do we have another instance of falsifying evidence, but in this case, Lana absolutely is an accessory. Gant orders Lana to stab Goodman's body with Edgeworth's knife as a part of his plan to frame the murder on Edgeworth. While Lana ends up being the person accused of murder after getting caught by Angel Starr, Lana was still falsifying evidence and violating the statute, particularly by stabbing the body with Edgeworth's knife with the intent to have that knife introduced as evidence of the murder weapon. So there was automatically another misdemeanor. More detrimental to Lana's final punishment is that this time, Lana knows that Gant is the killer, and she is acting with the specific intent to shield him from arrest or conviction for a felony. This means that Lana would clearly be deemed an accessory to the murder of Bruce Goodman. That accessory charge comes with a year in jail, a fine of $5,000, or both. Summing up Lana's crimes, both misdemeanors for falsifying evidence carry 6 months in jail and or a $1,000 fine each. Add those to the accessory charge, and the Skye sisters can tentatively look forward to reuniting on the outside after Lana spends 2 years in jail and pays $7,000 in fines. Now, Lana's sentence may well be longer than this, since we don't know what other illegal activities she does at Gant's behest in the years between SL9 and Rise from the Ashes. And when Emma returns in Apollo Justice, spoiler alert, I guess, we don't learn whether Lana is out of incarceration or not. But for what I can directly identify from the game's events, it's 2 years away and $7,000 in monetary penalties. Which, not the worst consequences given all that has happened. And now, just one final criminal to round it all out. It's our favorite Texaboo, Jake Marshall. With the SL9 case set to be closed for good, Jake enacts his own plan to make one last desperate attempt to learn the truth about what happened to his brother. To start his plan, he steals Bruce Goodman's ID card so he can gain access to the evidence room. We've talked about burglary and robbery, two different types of stealing crimes, but we have yet to define larceny, the most basic form of just stealing something. Part 1, Title 13, Chapter 5, entitled Larceny, states, in Section 484, every person who shall feloniously steal, take, carry, lead, or drive away the personal property of another, or who shall fraudulently appropriate property which has been entrusted to him or her, lots of more clauses, yada yada yada, is guilty of theft. So, yeah, larceny just means theft. Section 486 lays out two different types of theft, grand theft or petty theft. with the most general distinction found in Section 487 being that if the value of the property stolen is worth more than $950, it's grand theft. If the value is equal to or less than $950, then it's petty theft. It's way more complicated than that, but for our purposes, let's assume Bruce Goodman's ID is not worth more than $950 and say that Jake Marshall commits petty theft. Section 490 punishes petty theft by fine not exceeding $1,000 or by imprisonment in the county jail not exceeding 6 months or both. So it's basically a misdemeanor. Once Jake has Bruce Goodman's ID, he then dons Bruce's classic all-white detective outfit and uses his ID to get into the evidence room and retrieve the evidence from the SL9 incident. I looked around California's chapter on false personation and cheats and found something in Section 538D that feels relevant. The section reads, any person other than one who, by law, is given the authority of a peace officer who willfully wears, exhibits, or uses the authorized uniform of a peace officer with the intent of fraudulently impersonating a peace officer is guilty of a misdemeanor. Now, I'm stretching a little bit here because the first clause of that section states that this applies to any person other than one who is by law given the authority of a peace officer, because Jake is still a peace officer, even if a demoted one, in that he's no longer a detective. But he does still impersonate a higher-ranking police officer, as Bruce is still a detective. So he is assuming an authority level that he does not currently have. And he does use Bruce's ID card to get into the evidence room. There is an argument to be made that Jake's offense still falls within the spirit of this statute, as it is reasonably designed to prevent people from using the authority of a peace officer to do something they would not otherwise be allowed to do. So one can make the argument that a court could interpret this statute broadly enough to find Jake guilty of a misdemeanor here, and just for funsies, I'm going to throw it into his final sentence, because I feel like it fits, even if it's not directly violating the wording. Once again, my video essay, I can do that. Finally, while in the evidence room, we have two different acts from Jake that could result in criminal liability. The first of which occurs when Jake pulls a knife on one Mike Meekins. Obligatory blood dimension joke, watch our content. Now, Jake technically never actually attacks Mike with the knife, as when you finally get Meekins' side of the story, it is made clear that Meekins lunges at Jake and gets injured in the process. However, after the knife incident, Jake does punch Mike Meekins and knock him unconscious. So what we have is a threat with a knife and an actual attack with a fist. Let's discuss both of these at once. Assault is, as defined earlier, an unlawful attempt coupled with a present ability to commit a violent injury on the person of another. Jake pulls the knife, but does he ever really attempt to commit an injury using the knife, or was he just trying to scare Meekins? The question at hand is whether the drawing of the knife is enough on its own to fall into the definition of assault as an attempt. Now, there is a different CPC section on criminal threats, but that requires an actual threatening statement to be made, and we have no evidence that Jake made any verbal threats to Mike before Mike acted. Reaching back to my days as a criminal justice student and my time in law school, I know that in certain jurisdictions, pulling a gun on someone by itself can be considered assault, even if no actual attempt to use the gun is made. I don't know if California comes to the same conclusion, and nothing in the statutory text helps. And if I had the time and resources to go digging through case law, I could probably find a definite answer, but since I don't, I am going to lean towards yes, that Jake could be prosecuted and found guilty of assault, as drawing a knife on someone falls within a liberal understanding of the phrase, an unlawful attempt to commit injury. As for punishment, Section 245 subsection C states that any person who commits an assault with a deadly weapon or instrument other than a firearm, or by any means likely to produce great bodily injury upon the person of a peace officer or firefighter, shall be punished by imprisonment in the state prison for 3, 4, or 5 years. A knife is a deadly weapon, that's evident on its face, and Meekins is a peace officer. So this is the most likely section that Jake's actions would be prosecuted under. For the knockout punch that occurs after, we have a much more standard case of battery. Looking back at that definition, punching someone unconscious is clearly a willful and unlawful use of violence on the person of another. And once again, since Meekins is a peace officer acting in the course of his duties, we have to look to section 243 subsection C paragraph 2 and find that battery in this case is punishable by a fine of not more than $10,000 or imprisonment in a county jail not exceeding 1 year, or by both that fine and imprisonment. I do want to mention that in this case, because the assault with a deadly weapon charge includes elements not found in simple battery, i.e. the deadly weapon part, these crimes should be prosecuted separately, unlike simple assault and simple battery. So both punishments can end up in Jake's final sentence. Okay, final tally of the video. Petty theft nets Jake 6 months in jail, a $1,000 fine, or both. The misdemeanor for impersonating Bruce is punished the same as the petty theft. Assault with a deadly weapon against a peace officer results in at least 3 years in prison, and then the simple battery against a peace officer is 1 year in jail, a $10,000 fine, or both. So Jake Marshall ends up with a minimum of 3 years in prison, 2 years in jail, and up to $12,000 in fines. Yeehaw, partner. Yeehaw. And that's it. We did it! 12 criminals over 5 cases. From Joe Darke's and Damon Gant's multiple life sentences to Sal Manella's 6 months in jail. I think we got them all. I want to thank you all for watching this video. I've never written a video essay script or recorded anything this big before, so I hope it all turned out well and you enjoyed yourselves and maybe even learned something. And if you want sequel videos covering Justice for All and Trials and Tribulations, then please comment, hype up, and share this video. I definitely wouldn't mind doing more, but this was a lot of work and required more than just my time and effort, so a little validation would go a long way if we want more of these. Super mega shout out to Zach for doing the editing for this video, and super shout outs to both Zach and Jason for assisting with fine-tuning the script, and for just being solid sources of advice for tips on video recording. Another thanks to Carl, who assisted on edits. And credit to friend of the team Nez, who did the artwork of the sprites of me in this video. And finally, thanks to all our patrons, subscribers, and donators, and anyone else who supports Save Data in any way. And, I don't know how to conclude a video essay, so other generic things. Like and comment this video, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on other social medias. You can find me on Twitter with the handle @DapperDastard, but I pretty much never post anything, and I'll probably be moving to Blue Sky soon anyway. Watch Saving Throw, Zach, throw on the Patreon song. Bye!
Thank 'em, gotta thank 'em all. Gotta thank 'em all, our Patreons! Burger Bun, Captain Malik Bun, Andy Cosmo, Dave Hall, Lucha, and Sofino. HSM, Ernest, Marks, The Jester, Yane Love, Logan 01, Jack Warner. Witch Tower, Kevin, Asian, and Selfaria, Arky, Forensic, Beck, Nicole, Smart Alec, Mystic, Woody. Leprechaun, Jacob Bell, Crimson, Chrissy, Victor Alexander, Shadowed Navi, Soul Masters, BBC, Watts, and Riser, Sherlock, Sillert, Mr. Mocha, Strawbreaker, Honey Moera, Lil Ghost, Love, Godwin, Don, Ruby, John, Ashkin, Kira, Mega Zero, and Boomer, Emily. Plethora of penguins and who need to sleep, Alea, Yakta, Est, Ever, Entropy, JFJ, Nightwing, Ichiza, T, The Driver, 458, ATD. Maho Stars, Red Crest, Will Ben and Chosen, Tin, Mickey, Anime, Checker, Knight, and JC, Foxington. And his bananas, Lord Byron, Siegfried, Hurricane, Yagi, with Mercury, Sheberstein, Cynthios, Hannah, Fluffy, Senpai, Nani, Sparrow, Elijah, Slime. Don't forget Panic, Pang, Sakuri, Gossman, also Mystic, Owl, and Amelia the Min. Dessert Boy Man, Schmargelblurt, Rick Rat, Katja, Traveling in a Box, and Snowcat, Conjuring, Scribes, Croissant, Fofilla, Written Word, Ginkgo, and Sibylla. Thank 'em, gotta thank 'em all. Gotta thank 'em all, our Patreons.